Thank you all for coming. This is Premal. I'm the founder of Accorian, and we're doing things a bit differently today. We're going to be talking about, from our experience and the experience of two of the panelists today, Sean and Andrea, what are the common mistakes clients, companies make as they go through HITRUST? And the reason we're doing this is more to educate everybody, make them think about these issues, and frankly, make as Sean would say, try to make a complex process less complex if possible. So that's what this webinar is about. We're going to try to stick to 30 minutes. If you do have questions, feel free to type those questions in, and we'll try to flow them in where appropriate. Very quickly, one slide in Accorian, we are a HITRUST assessor. We help our clients all the way from strategy, compliance, consulting, testing, and HITRUST being one of the things we focus on, but of course we also do other compliance standards as well. The slides today, just to set context for everyone, what we're not talking about is really HITRUST 101, right? So we're not talking about domains and scoring and how things get scored, but really the common issues that we've seen by doing a number of these assessments. Most of the slides, or the next 7 slides, are going to be presented by Sean and Andrea. Between the two of them, they've done more than 300 validated assessments. So, we thought it would make sense to take their experience and then boil it down to, hey, here are the things that you have to be thinking about as you go through HITRUST. So again, this is very much focused on mistakes, or things to get better at, things to keep in mind. If you are still thinking of HITRUST, you need more of a HITRUST 101, we do have webinars specifically on that we can talk about a separate one. I'm going to hand it over to Andrea and Sean.
Thanks, Premal. So Sean and I are going to play a little tag team that we're talking about those mistakes or issues that we're here to learn about today. The first thing that I'd like to talk about is the scope of the assessment. So in real estate, they say it's all about location, location, location. And in a HITRUST assessment, it's all about scoping, scoping, scoping. Getting the scope wrong can make it almost impossible to assess correctly, which that can lead to even HITRUST denying your certification. Trying to bring all systems within your whole organization into scope could create an assessment too large to manage, as well as create huge impacts on the resources that are working on that assessment, both your side and your assessor side. Creating too small of a scope can be as detrimental to your overall assessment as having a scope that's too large. That can create questions about just how meaningful your assessment is, along with inviting scope creep, which is never a good thing when you're in the middle of an audit or an assessment. Second thing I wanted to talk about is not realizing the commitment needed from those resources. So going through a HITRUST assessment, it's hard. Ensuring your policies and procedures include all of those required elements, understanding the controls, the implemented evidence collection is time consuming. If your assessment requires extensive remediation identified during that discovery period, then followed by incubation, and then evidence collection and validation testing, you could be seeing active involvement from your core HITRUST resources for a year or more. Your core team must also be able to rely on some of the other departments within your organization or other business units. Those are folks that we would need to interview or actually gather evidence from, such as HR, when we may be talking about training, legal, and sometimes other divisions in operations. As your HITRUST external assessor, we can't validate your evidence until you provide it to us in a clear and timely way. We can provide guidance and advisory services during the discovery process, but our ultimate responsibility is to validate the evidence you provide so we can submit to HITRUST in a very well-prepared and clear way for their consideration. So next, Sean's going to talk about the actual HITRUST framework.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, one of the biggest problems we do run into is from a client position, just their inability to understand, what the HITRUST framework is, what the controls actually mean to them, and then the process of actually reviewing and scoring them. So it's very imperative that the lead of the client side understand the client, that the HITRUST CSF and the associated scoring rubric, cybersecurity compliance as a whole within their organization, and then their overall organizational structure. This becomes key when we start asking a lot of the specific questions around what do you guys do, how do you guys do it. Some of that may have to come from different resources within the organization, but the lead of the project should have a strong understanding of those areas. One of the great things that's going to help improve this process, HITRUST just recently rolled out the new HITRUST adoption course. It's designed to provide an in-depth understanding of information risk, the approaches to assessing and controlling risk within the organization. They provide guidance on integrating HITRUST into your organization's compliance program as well. So it's highly recommended that if you're new to HITRUST, if you've never done this before, you are leading a project, or that you're going to be participating within your organization's adoption of HITRUST, that you guys attend this course. It's a $2,000 course per attendee, runs for 3 days. And I think it's about 3 hours. I think it usually runs like 12:30 to 3:30 Central Time. So it's definitely something that we highly recommend. For organizations that are planning to leverage the HITRUST CSF framework and processes internally, or if you want to learn more about how to prepare and perform HITRUST assessments, you can go the route of becoming certified. The HITRUST Certified CSF Practitioner course, or the CCSFP, would be recommended. The CCSFP course includes an in-depth structure on risk management practices, how to implement the HITRUST CSF framework, and utilize the methodology to perform and score assessments and validate compliance. The curriculum is supported by case studies, hands-on learning, and real-world application of the knowledge learned. A little bit more expensive. This one's going to run about $3,000. It takes a week. Right now, they are still doing it virtually. There is a requirement. At some point, it'll go back to having you be on site in Frisco, Texas, to do this. The good news about it is you do come out of that with an actual certification. You become CCSFP certified, and a lot of benefits come along with that, with being able to help manage your framework with the adoption of HITRUST.
Hey, Sean, sorry to interrupt, if you don't mind. This is really important. I think too many of our clients, or just people that are going through HITRUST, are trying to outsource the understanding of controls to the assessor firm. You really can't do that, right, Sean? You have to know enough of the detail to be able to implement them yourselves. When we are doing a validation and audit, we are the auditors. Yes, we can help before that from a discovery perspective, but you really truly need to do your due diligence in understanding the controls and how things get scored. And it is complicated, right? We're not saying it's simple, but to get through HITRUST, you have to get to that level of detail.
Absolutely. It's imperative. And we do see clients get lost in a loop that don't understand, the controls, the level that they need to be implemented, what the organization has to do. And it ends up delaying the entire validated process, because we end up having to go back, work with the client on, what implementations or documentation needs to be done. And in many cases, that could take several months to complete. So again, we keep pushing the dates back, waiting for the client to get up to speed with where they are before we can even start the audit process. There's a lot of information available on the HITRUST site, and I highly recommend everybody go out and take a look at it. Organizations, we highly recommend organizations that are adopting the HITRUST CSF framework, download the framework. You can actually go register on the HITRUST website and download an overall copy of the framework. It won't have all the prescriptive details in it for your organization, but you will get a clear understanding of what the controls look like, what level that they're asking for. And in many cases, you can look at some of the details within the illustrated procedures and see the level of evidence that you're going to have to produce in order for us to validate that you've implemented the control requirements. The next area that we're going to talk about with organizations struggling with attempting to complete a self-assessment alone. Within the process of doing your validated assessment, HITRUST offers up the ability for you to conduct an internal self-assessment. This has been recently renamed to the BC. It's still a self-assessment. It's a process within your organization that you set up your scoping, you work through what your organization's information security management program looks like, apply the control list to that, and then self-score yourself and say, hey, yeah, we're there or we're not there. This is done basically just as a baseline for you. It's not a certification process or anything like that, but it's very highly recommended that an organization go through and conduct this evaluation so you can figure out exactly where you currently stand with your information program. The primary benefits of using the HITRUST a self-assessment or the BC instead of a standardized information gathering questionnaire or other self-assessment mechanism is that it uses the HITRUST what they call the assurance intelligence engine. And it's actually an AI engine that they've rolled out here in the past couple of years, and they've worked very diligently to improve it. But they'll take and review the scores that you put in there for yourself. They'll review the responses that you put up there, and they'll come back with some recommendations from where you need to work on improvements within your program. That being stated, engaging with a HITRUST certified assessment firm is going to be key. We feel it's key for you to do that. And again, just as we're talking about, interpretation of those controls can be very tricky. Understanding your scoping, as Andrea pointed out earlier, some of that stuff really doesn't make sense to the novice that's coming in and just starting to work with us here. So we recommend engaging with a HITRUST certified assessor firm prior to doing your self-assessment. This way we make sure that we work through what the scoping is going to look like. What are you going to actually include within the assessment process? And then also help you work through what does these requirements mean? How am I supposed to implement this within my organization? We are also a cybersecurity firm, and Premal will talk a little bit more later on about how we can help you guys with this. But a lot of what we can bring to the plate that some other firms may not be able to is if you do have gaps that are identified during that process, we can drive you in the right direction, what tools you need to implement, what's the verbiage that needs to be included in your documentation, so on and so forth. So having a reliable partner to help you interpret the control requirements, establish gap reports, a remediation plan, all that will help eliminate the guesswork and ease the adoption of the HITRUST CSF program into your organization.
Hey, Sean, so one thing I would add on this one, again, is companies have done the self-assessment alone, and you can, because it's not a validated assessment, is we've seen them at times being too optimistic, right? Because they don't understand enough of the details of HITRUST and the scoring rubric and the things we talked about in the last couple of slides. And what ends up happening is they think they're in better shape because they understand their own processes, even if they're not documented. And so they score themselves higher, think they have less gaps. And then when they do bring an assessor firm in, because the assessor firm is looking at the evidence and can't take their word for it, they have to have evidence behind it, then they get scored lower, and then that leads to all sorts of problems afterwards. So being too optimistic, the optimistic bias you might have internally is an issue we've seen more consistently when people do their self-assessment themselves.
Exactly, and one of the concepts that we try to approach it with is, we want organizations to be, secure. We want them to have all the information they need, but we will come back with the key. Now you got to prove it. Show us how you've implemented this. We can't take your word for it. You can't make up documentation as we're asking the question. HITRUST, requires us to go back and look at, processes in place, for a minimum of 90 days before we can look at that. So, if you look at their controls and the scoring that we have to go through in the validation process we go through, you'll see that, we have to pull samples. A ton of samples have to be reviewed for this here to go back and say, yes, not only has the organization had this implemented, they've been practicing what it says for this period of time.
Cool.
So, all right, I'm going to pass the conversation back over to Andrea. She's going to be, taking a look at, concerns with understanding the timelines within HITRUST.
Thanks, Sean. So as I mentioned before, coming into a high trust assessment without realizing the overall time frame for the entire project is a mistake that we've seen, and that can truly impact your resources in a way that you don't really plan for. But also more important is not understanding those high trust mandated timelines. They have an impact on your assessment. Sean touched on them just a little bit here, but for example, if during discovery, changes are made to policies and procedures, and you've had to remediate, all of that information, all those document changes need to be fully complete. And that means the documents are updated, distributed to the workforce, and included in any training if that is mandated. And all that needs to happen before that incubation time starts. An external assessor cannot test those updated policy and procedures until they've been implemented and they've been in that steady state or incubation for 60 days. If any new processes were implemented or significant changes to an existing procedure, if that occurs during remediation, then those changes need to be in place for, as Sean mentioned, 90 days before the external assessor can ask you to provide evidence. And we need to have 90 days worth of evidence. So incubation needs to be fully complete before we can ask for evidence for those implemented changes. Another high trust timeline that must be followed by all external assessor companies is a 90-day validation testing timeframe. And that means that once an external assessor goes into MyCSF, and HITRUST tracks this, once they go in and score a control or agree to the client's score of a maturity level, that starts the 90-day clock. So if the client delays providing evidence for an assessment that impacts that 90 days being pushed out, that can impact the entire testing period, and possibly the external assessor would need to start over because HITRUST holds us to that 90-day test period. If some of you have been involved in HITRUST recently, you know they have that new reservation process, which is great because it gives you an opportunity to see where you are after you submit. However, if you miss your scheduled submission date, and if you don't change that date within MyCSF before the deadline to do so, it'll cost you. So you want to make sure you're aware of that timeline as well. And finally, after you've done all the hard work to get your assessment complete and you've submitted to HITRUST, you don't want to run off and start your vacation just yet, because once your assessment gets through the HITRUST QA process, they're going to send you a draft of the report, and you have to review that report and respond to it within 30 days of receipt. In addition, if you've had any corrective action plans noted, you need to develop and insert those corrective action plans into MyCSF as well.
And one thing to add to that too, Andrea, is, and just so everybody's aware, when we do submit it to HITRUST, in most cases, we'll handle the interaction between HITRUST and questions they're going to have about your assessment. But there are cases and situations where we may need to reach out to you or the leads within your organization to get additional information. If HITRUST questions a score on something, or they question the evidence that's been supplied, we may have to come back and ask for additional details from you or something along those lines as well. So again, just because we submit it, it does not mean it's over from that perspective.
Absolutely. And we're there for you. Another mistake that we've seen is starting to gather, for the assessed entities, starting to gather evidence too soon. As I mentioned, if you have any of those policies, procedures, or any of those technical implementations in remediation, you have to wait until after that incubation starts, or excuse me, after that incubation is over to gather any evidence for those controls. As you can see on the slide here, there are a lot of controls in what we call a standard size assessment, which is between 250, 275 controls, where sample testing is required. About 80 to 85% of those controls are sample testing. HITRUST requires that we select samples to test. So what needs to happen is, first, the assessed entity needs to compile what I call their lists of things, and those are population files. So whether it's a list of all of your in-scope systems, and applications, a list of your endpoints, a list of logs created over the last 90 days, a list of incidents that occurred maybe during the past year. Your population files need to be completed first. And then your assessor comes along and selects the required number of sampled items. And this is, again, HITRUST required. They give us our sampling requirements. And those are all selected based on those total populations. Only then is it time that you gather the evidence for those items selected in the sample. An example of why this is so important to an assessed entity is you don't want to provide evidence for a total population, say, of 50 laptops, when you really only need to provide evidence for 5 of those laptops. So it saves you time if you stick within the guidelines of not providing your evidence too soon. So that does it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Sean to talk about.
Just one question that's come up. Does the external assessor choose the samples? Or
The external assessor is required to choose the samples. Yeah, so that's why those population files are so important to get done prior to gathering any evidence so we can get those samples selected.
And just so this is clear to people, so I'll give a very bad example, right? And Andrea, to it, which is, you have a list of employees. We'll choose the ones and say, okay, for these set of employees, show us that you've done background checks, right? So that's an example of when first we need the list of the population file, the list of employees.
Right.
We're choosing the evidence that we need for each one in that sample set.
Correct.
And as a assessed firm, you can say, hey, here's the background checks on these 7 employees, because
right.
those might be the ones we chose.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yep. All right. Sean's going to talk about the role of the assessor firm.
All right. As I mentioned earlier, from our perspective, we want you to engage with an assessor firm as early as you possibly can. But at some point or another, you're going to have to engage with an assessor firm. The assessor firms are the only ones that are permitted to conduct the validated assessment. Many firms offer a pre-assessment, style service, which is what I mentioned earlier. They'll offer things, support services like gap reviews, implementation guidance, remediation support. Assessor firms and their personnel are very limited to the level of support that they can provide to an organization. And this becomes very key depending on what role they're playing. Again, for the most part, when it comes to the validated assessment, we are to be auditors. So an organization like Accorian, like ourselves, we will work with you to prep for the validated assessment. We'll work with you to identify gaps and remediate those. That is a complete separate team. So firms need to maintain a clear segregation between the individuals that perform support services and those that conduct the validated assessment. In order to maintain the integrity of the assessment, the assessor or the auditor and their leadership are prohibited from conducting support services if they will be performing the validated assessment. Again, it's integrity that we're trying to maintain. I can't go tell you how to fix something and then come back and be the guy that says, hey, yeah, everything looks great. We'll go ahead and score it and move it on. The assessor firm is ultimately responsible for maintaining that integrity of the assessment. We cannot provide any guidance or advice during the validated assessment period. Once it's started, we are asking you guys to tell us how you do it. So that becomes very key within understanding this, the role between, what maybe we were doing prior to the start of the validated assessment and then what we're allowed to do now. Also, assessor firms must ensure that individuals performing the audit task do not participate in any remediation or consulting services as well. And this can become very sticky for organizations, especially if you've engaged somebody to help you write your P&P or update some documentation, and then later on they cannot be part of the assessment team. So again, we want to make sure we're very clear on what the roles and responsibilities are within the assessor firm. It's also important that an assessor firm cannot guarantee an organization will pass the assessment and receive certification from HITRUST. Firms that are assisting organizations with their remediation effort should review the CSF for compliance requirements and provide guidance as needed, but it is the organization's responsibility to ensure proper control adherence is in place prior to conducting a validated assessment. Even though we've worked with you on implementing different processes, putting documentation in, we may develop a level of confidence that you're going to meet all the requirements through the validated assessment. but we cannot put it in writing that you are going to pass. We don't know exactly until we actually dig in to all the sample evidence that Andrea talked about. If you've actually, are meeting those controls, if it's been implemented, if everybody's following what needs to be done. Again, that cannot be determined until we actually start reviewing the evidence. Unfortunately, that puts us in a bind that if we find out that organizations aren't following processes or haven't implemented, controls to the level, it again will delay the assessment, period, and we may have to restart.
Hey, Sean, just on that, what I'd say is assessor firms need to know at some point, whether it's us or whoever you're using, we've become auditors, right? So you have to provide the evidence. You have to score the evidence in MyCSF, and we have to audit that to make sure the scoring is correct. So I'll take an example. I'll take the same background check example, right? So if in discovery we realize you don't do background checks, we can tell that and say, hey, that's what you should be doing. You as a company implement background checks. When we're in the audit process, as Andrea mentioned, we look at the population file, we look at the sample, and we say, okay, these are the 7 employees we want background checks on. You have to show the evidence that you've done it for those 7 employees. It doesn't help, you could have done it for other employees, but if those 7 are not in it, then that's a gap that will be called out. Does that make sense? So keep that in mind, that at some point we go from being consulting to auditors. We have 2 different teams to do that. And that has to be the way it's handled with HITRUST.
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, we want to make sure, and we do have it within our processes within Accorian, where we have clear separation. We have identified handoffs from one team to the next. We make sure we communicate that very clearly. And then we also monitor throughout the validated process that nobody from our team is using information or talking with anybody that was part of the remediation process. Okay, Premal will now walk through the Accorian processes and how we can help your organization avoid some of these pitfalls that we've talked about, and hopefully successfully adopt HITRUST into your program.
Yeah, so we wanted this webinar to be very much about common mistakes made. So of course we have a process and we can help you with a number of things, but in reality, whether you're using us as the assessor firm, or you're using someone else, these are common mistakes that are made across the board. So it's important for you to think about them, important for you to make sure you've accounted for them, right? Things like understanding your controls, understanding scope, going to the HITRUST classes are really key. The number of times you've seen clients not really understand their controls, thinking they've implemented them, and then coming to us for a validation. It's just not a good situation to be in. So can we help? Absolutely. We've done a number of these things. We have a methodology behind it. But reality, these are the common mistakes we see being made by firms getting assessed. We do have a question or two, and I know we're out of time. I'll just get to one question. If others have questions, please put them into the Q&A. Sean or Andrea, the one question we have is, between now that there's a whole I-1 and R2 process, does that change any of these common mistakes, or are they basically the same between them?
I can take that if you want me to, Sean. It doesn't change a lot of them. Obviously, scope is still important. What the I-1 takes out of the scoring is policy and procedures. However, as a validation assessor, I need to know how you do something. So when I receive that implemented evidence from you, I understand what it is I'm looking at. So even though we may not be scoring policy and procedure, we still need policy and procedure to be able to review and test the implemented evidence. So in those instances, it's different just because of the not scoring of the policy and procedure. It does create that set of standard unchangeable requirement statements. So it makes it a little bit easier if you know going in exactly what you need to meet. But other than that, it's pretty much the same. Yep. We would still go through the discovery and find out if you have any gaps there and advise accordingly.
Okay, I think if there are other questions, we'll have to take them offline a bit. But thank you for your time. I know this was a half an hour one. We wanted to try to limit the time down and get you bite-sized experiences and learnings. But if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. We will be sharing this webinar for those who attended, or a cheat sheet, if you will, and then going down that path. Sean, Andrea, anything else to add around this?
I'm not good. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you.